My name is Evan Hayles Gledhill, as it's on screen, and I mostly teach at Reading in the film, television and theatre department, television and film. And why am I talking about music videos then? Well, I'm basically applying all my years of study to all my years of nerdery, as I said earlier. So, confession, I was a bit of a teenage goth in the 90s, shocker. And this picture that I'm going to share is from my 20s, but back when I was still thinking that I was probably a girl. So yeah, there we go. That is me and my best mate. So full on goth, right? This is Own Voices goth for goth here. So the music videos are their own special screen media, but they draw from commercial cinema, television, advertising, art house, live performance. You name it, you can find it in these little films. They're both art and advert. So why the 90s? Well, because it's nostalgia, as everyone's enjoying these talks, but because it's back in a big way, in the circular nature of fashion, and because this period is quite like our own, with huge progressive political movements going on, but also a huge backlash from the conservative side as well. So hopefully this talk will be entertaining, if I'm doing my job right. Terms and conditions apply though. Content warning, not only for my bad fashion, and I might get a bit sweary, but also for violence, swords with dripping blood, threats of sexual assault, cesareans and surgery, slavery, snakes, Satanism, and skeletons. Obviously, it's going to get gothic. And I also wrote this talk, as I said this morning, whilst listening to Ministry. So you've been warned, okay? So this wee seminar will be in 3 parts, with breaks in between for chatting, feedback, use the loo, reminiscing about the 90s. Warning, the images are often very dark. 90s film quality is also not always great. So please do turn up your screen brightness. It might make us look a bit ghostly, but that's great because, you know, hey, it's the Gothic. And make sure your sound's up because there are going to be clips. So in the first section, we're going to look at what the Gothic looked like in the 90s in terms of major genre fiction on screen and our aesthetic expectations of that. And I'll use examples mostly from film with a few references to TV. And I'll give an overview for those who weren't born or weren't interested at the time. The next section, we will actually watch some music videos, finally. In this section, we'll start with the mainstream music. How does the Gothic get used by non-Goth performers, such as Celine Dion and the Backstreet Boys, and even the Red Hot Chili Peppers? So what does the occasional trip into the Gothic offer for those who don't want to be identified with it permanently? And we'll link back to the first section to try and discuss some of the reasons these aesthetics became popular and how they signify in the 90s. And then in the final section, ooh, there we go, we'll start to look at the locations we expect to find the Gothic, right, in the music. So a bit of heavy metal, some horrorcore rap, Marilyn Manson. How and why does the Gothic help people rebel against or protest mainstream and normative ideals? And why is this still considered shocking 30 or more years after the punks and goths and metalheads started to appear, and 200 years after the Gothic genre started with its disinterred corpses and vampires and everything? So I'm not picking real subculture goth here. We're talking about what makes it into the mainstream, what dominates this image of 90s Gothic, okay? So we also have a competition, all right? So how many Oscar winners, just to check you're paying attention, how many Oscar winners are on the following slides, okay? I'll let you know at the end. The only prize is the eternal smugness of having been right. But that's a pretty good prize, as most of you, I'm sure, will agree. Right, so here we go, part 1, Gothic on screen in the 90s. We're all aware that there are different types of the Gothic, especially those of us who've been attending Sam's regular classes or watching the recordings. In literature, we have the first wave of Gothic in the late 18th century, often set even further back in the past. And examples here are Anne Radcliffe, who is a big name, her big seller, Mysteries of Udolpho, and the oft adapted Frankenstein that I'm sure many people are familiar with. And then we have Victorian Gothic, often dealing with ghost stories or family sagas. So those also, again, take us back into the past with generations and dead people. And then we have the Gothic of the early 20th century, which looks significantly different because modernism has ripped everything to shreds. So we've got German Expressionism as a major influence and the Hollywood film noir. And these all contribute key aesthetic elements to the 90s Gothic, I'll argue. I'm going to label them in an aesthetic timeline as Romantic Gothic, Neo-Victorian Gothic, and pre-war Gothic. And this is because there are overlaps and no really specific boundaries to these time periods. Most people's grasp of 1920s versus 1930s fashion or late Georgian to Victorian changes in interior decor, it's going to be pretty vague, and Hollywood probably didn't help with that. So Romantic Gothic vaguely gives us castles, candelabra, A-line dresses that show a lot of cleavage. Victorian Gothic gives us spooky wood-panelled mansions, top hats, waistcoats, and corsets. Then the aesthetically radically different. And we get high contrast shadows and light play called chiaroscuro, and exaggerated angular sets and costumes that are not really meant to be realistic, but very performative. And some would like to link this to Freudian sort of ideals, but I don't do psychoanalysis, so you can all just like make your own interpretations on that score. So that was not supposed to be a whistle-stop tour of the history of the Gothic as it really is, or as it is constructed by literary criticism or anything. It's more how we construct it looking back, how later generations imagine it, right? Through adaptation, reinvention, and the low-budget costume drama. This is a timeline of our expectations of different types of Gothic. And as they are marketed and sold to us as well, it's a packaging idea. So I'll demonstrate how these three key aesthetic periods appear in the screen culture of the 90s. But first, a small example to show just how far from the first wave we had shifted by the 90s. To return to pop music for a moment, in 1991, Bryan Adams' Everything I Do It For You topped the music charts in the UK, USA, and Canada. I am not going to be showing you the video because it has been scrubbed from the internet, probably for copyright reasons, but I assume it's because Bryan is just a bit embarrassed. But as the theme tune to the film Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, the video uses the settings and clips from the film, a story which has all the trappings of the first wave Gothic. An impoverished castle estate, wrongly usurped from a crusading knight, played by Kevin Costner. He returns from the wars with the trusted retainer of foreign appearance, and finds a corrupt church, a wicked witch, and a rapey villain, all conspiring to force the spirited heroine into a marriage that will legitimate their riches and their powers. Where am I up to? So, if you're not convinced by that, I am now going to do a quick run through of every single Gothic trope in this film, okay? Hold your horses, it goes fast. Exotic Middle Eastern opening, torture dungeons, threat of dismemberment, necessary alliance with mysterious stranger, oath sworn to the dying, symbolic jewellery for identification purposes, hiding from the palace guards, good patriarch who will die, creepy nighttime posse, ritual masks and hoods, pay end to freedom and homeland, a blood debt, attempted benevolent kidnap for his own good, sublime scenery as a backdrop to a discussion of racial equality, so a 2-for-1 in that scene, discussion of the nature of beauty and womanhood, followers of Muhammad, spelt with a T because it's the 18th century, villain's abuse of power, hunting a child on horseback with dogs, villain has vast turreted castle with mysterious passages, villainous seductions, secret spy holes in the castle, the witch's lair, note animal familiars, gibbet in the ruins, complete with surprise skeleton. Disfigured aged retainer, servant and master swap identities, heroine disguised as a boy, hero tries to establish sibling-like relationship with heroine, you cannot replace my brother. Chase scene through the sublime scenery, haunted forest, supernatural revealed to be in fact wind chimes. Camp of the gypsies, displaced persons, bandits. Satanic rituals that invoke Catholicism, disguised as a leper, highway robbery. The villain is vain, the villains are cousins, resourceful heroine, advanced body science, in this case a cesarean, betrayal by a priest, more weird rituals, savage Celts. actual kidnapping, another torture dungeon, unwanted marriage proposal, secret illegitimate sibling, villain descends into paranoia, speech against tyranny, forced marriage, attempted rape, church corruption, defenestration, and a fabulous romance in the presence of a corpse. And breathe. That is over 50 goth points of comparison. That's like goth AF. And look at this shot. They're literally framed by Gothic archers and Alan Rickman. Yeah, basically, this film is a Gothic masterpiece, and I bloody love it. And this is the hill I will die on. But this film is not marketed as Gothic. It's rarely ever discussed in the terms of the genre, and it shows how far our expectations of what is Gothic have changed by the 90s. If you showed this to Anne Radcliffe, I think she'd probably recognise it, possibly even enjoy it. And I'm absolutely certain that Matthew Lewis would love Alan Rickman's high camp orgy-throwing Sheriff of Nottingham. So what, in the late 20th century, was Gothic, if not this? Well, the genres had already shifted our focus through the adaptations, from the more distant to the recent past, from a time before the Reformation and ecclesiastical conflicts about money and power, to an era of class conflicts and fight about money and power. So we have the time before Lord Hardwicke's Marriage Act in 1750, which made women property, to the Married Women's Property Act, which reversed some of that. So there were always stories of struggle against some dark and evil foe. And the source of the terror doesn't really change. It's always men with power. But how they wield that power and what kind of power we're talking about and who we want to focus on is what changes. So those Victorian stories that I mentioned in the timeline, here are two 20th century adaptations. And these are stories that become really, really popular throughout the 20th century in adaptation. Turn of the Screw has been turned into ballets, Broadway plays, television drama, films, an opera even, as we can see on screen. Wuthering Heights even got a musical from Cliff Richards. So one question is, how do we disentangle our expectations and definitions of the Gothic from the period drama? Well, as one scholar of period adaptations says about TV adaptations, when the familiarity with the style and visual vocabulary of earlier representations of the serial can be used to undermine audience expectations and alert them to the constructedness of the imagery, another result of such familiarity with stylistic cues is that it may trigger associations and expectations that in turn create a conflict with the narrative demands, which need to be consciously addressed and counteracted. So our expectations are both set up and thwarted by the same shows and same films sometimes. Our reading of the media might not be what the producers intended, depending on our prior exposure to the same and related genre texts. So we put things together. We build a pattern. So your mileage may vary by viewer, and we're going to start to make you all viewers of the same thing by pulling out the aesthetics, the Romantic and Neo-Victorian Gothic. So having mentioned musicals, let's return there for a moment. For a period drama baseline establishment. Just before our key era of study today, both Claude Michel Schoenberg's Les Miserables in 1985 and Andrew Lloyd Webber's Phantom of the Opera in 1986 opened to become the most popular and long-running shows in the West End and Broadway at the time. Then Disney's Beauty and the Beast became a Gothic fantasy of castles, thunderstorms and ravines, and was the first Disney adaptation into a Broadway musical. Now, we've got very well-dressed revolutionary students there. Waistcoats, check. Tight trousers, check. High boots, yep. And frilly dresses and half-up, half-down hairdos. Candles and ornate ironwork. Lots of smoke and fog and hefty stonework. And also pick up on the colour scheme, okay? The red, the blue, and the gold for later use, because that's going to come up again. So apart from Phantom, these productions aren't marketed as Gothic either, but they definitely create an idea of a romantic past in both senses of the word, capital R, for a modern audience. And this can be seen to influence the actually acknowledged Gothic adaptations. So Hollywood was on a roll adapting classic 19th century Gothic novels in the early 90s. 1992, we've got Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights. In keeping with the book's original timeline, the clothing is early in the 18th century, and we have proper castle-like manor house, big gathered skirts, and men with windswept ponytails. We have lots of naturalistic lighting, a la Barry Lyndon, so we know that this is a serious period drama. And that's the film that Kubrick shot by candlelight in many scenes back in 1975. So this is marketed heavily as romantic. The trailer says, a love story, as timeless as the landscape that inspired it. Really? Charlotte Bronte, I think, was right when she called her sister's book full of perverse passions and passionate perversity. And I think claiming it as a love story is normalizing abuse, quite frankly. So where's the Gothic in this? Well, it's nodded to in the framing device, which looks a bit like a Scottish Widows advert, where a hooded author walks through the ruin of the building and talks about her inspiration for writing the story. So 2 years later, another authorial appeal to authenticity appears. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Frilly shirts, tight trousers, riding boots, candles. It's going all out. We have lots of body Gothic in this, dead and alive, and Goth Queen Helena Bonham Carter too. Although the era is romantic Gothic again, big capital R, aesthetically we get early type of Gothic cinema influencing it as well. Check out that sweeping staircase with no banister behind Ken. That is a concrete monstrosity, okay? The aesthetics of this film then are not only about period adaptation, but Gothic excess. And also Branagh wanting everyone to know that he's a bit pretty, right? But not as pretty as Brad Pitt. Nobody was back then, okay? Nobody. Not even Denzel, I'm going with it. But we digress. Shirts, frilly, waistcoats embroidered, the hair, the cravats, the lasting impact on contemporary goth fashions was considerable. You had two choices in 1994 as a goth, Brad Pitt or Brandon Lee, which we will move on to in a bit. And we're going to need a second slide now. Damask, coffins, petulant flouncing from Tom Cruise. The interiors are really lush with stonework, candelabra, chandeliers, and sweeping sets of stone steps into underground dungeons. Gold and red and blue everywhere, blood, lots of it. We've got the goth motherlode, okay? And we start in colonial America sometime in the 1800s, travel through the 1900s and into the present. But we miss the early 20th century. Minor spoiler, Claudia is dead and Lestat presumed so. So we basically skip an entire century of Louis moping about. Not to worry, because Brad Pitt takes his immortal beauty to Legends of the Fall before cutting off all his hair, and he'd already made A River Runs Through It, cementing the image of himself in a waistcoat as a preeminent sexual fantasy of the 90s for many people. Now, these two films are pre-war period drama for sure, but they are not Gothic. They are, however, part of the linking chain in Pitt's star persona, and this will become relevant in section 2, so remember that. Now, to the pre-war Gothic aesthetic itself, no better example of this impact in early 90s Gothic cinema than Tim Burton's Batman Returns. Young Bruce at his parents' murder scene is clearly 1930s noir framing. We've got black and white film stock, high contrast lighting, flash of the reporter's bulbs, bodies covered with sheets. But the Danny DeVito's Penguin there is drawing on the 19th century past for his authority. Yes, the 1930s still had people wearing those penguin suits, as we call them, but mostly for the opera or for weddings. So this villain is permanent attire, harks back, okay? It's a Gothic that works diegetically. He's Gothic in Gotham, which is no mean feat, by being of the past. The rest is modernist Gothic. So take a look at the background of the set here and ignore the penguins wired with explosive devices, because they are by no means the most ridiculous thing in this film, okay, and irrelevant to this talk. The sculptures there wouldn't be out of place at the Nuremberg Games. There's another big sweepy staircase, and it's made of concrete, a big arch, and we've got this weird folded concrete look of the building behind with no windows. This is a very modernist look. For those unfamiliar with modernist Gothic in cinema, and the film I mentioned earlier, Cabinet of Dr. Caligari from 1920, we can really see the influence on Tim Burton, if you're familiar with his wider work. The angles, the off-kilter shapes and structures, the crookedness of everything on scene. And the slender guy in black with his awkward movements set up in a clearly and deliberately unrealistic surroundings. And the face of the sleepwalker in the high contrast makeup, the black and the white with the big dark circles under the eyes. This film has had a huge impact on Gothic aesthetics on screen and in subculture. But those big sweeping staircases, well, they come from Todd Browning's 1931 Dracula. Visual impact high, realism low. I mean, gorgeous to look at, but imagine being hypnotized by a vampire and forced to walk down that without a railing. Death trap, right? So, on the topic of vampires, Bram Stoker's Dracula. We can see a bit of a trend in the titles here, can't we? It goes hard for the high Victorian aesthetic and the Orientalism of the book's original era. Major body horror and deformity going on, and neo-Victorian goth points all round. Observe, we have candelabras lit even when there's actually gas lights in use. It's the aesthetic, right? Red and gold, this film is drenched in those colours. Even Dracula's armour is red. Colours of danger, of opulence, of blood and power. The House of Lords and the High Court judges in the UK still wear red. It's Gothic, but it's also Technicolor, this film. This is a full camp extravaganza, a Hammer B movie with an all-star cast. And again, the love story is highlighted. The poster says it, the love never dies. Now, what does that remind me of? Well, Highlander, okay? I know this is the 80s, so technically outside, but worth mentioning in Dispatches for the impact, okay? It was directed by a guy who makes videos, music videos, and it has a soundtrack by Queen. I'm sad it falls outside the era of discussion. If only for taking the Gothic staircase to a ludicrous excess there. These tales of immortals in love with mortals, of pure evil versus goodness, and of redemption. These are the big themes coming through in this period's Gothic, right? So honourable mention also to television's Beauty and the Beast that ran from 1987 to 1990 in America. And no, nobody has photoshopped John Bon Jovi. That's Ron Perlman in heavy makeup, heavy prosthetics there. Of course, we also had lots of Gothic on TV, but we mostly had them in contemporary settings, even if their Gothic elements come from the past, like through the image of the vampire. So in Canada, we had the classic Forever Night, running from 92 to 96, about an 800-year-old vampire who uses his immortal afterlife to work as a policeman of all things. In America, the Addams and the Munsters both got brought back in live action, having been popular on film and in cartoon. And these shows all address more contemporary concerns. For example, the homeless who lived in the tunnels of the subway in New York become a semi-mythical community in Beauty and the Beast. This is an urban Gothic, which we see come to Hollywood, mostly in connection with concerns about race, poverty, and crime. Oh, surprise. So there are ruins, but they're really the empty spaces of the city, concrete car parks, vandalized public toilets, and broken and graffitied public housing. So here we go with another classic, Candyman. Everything is coming back round again, and we get a new adaptation later this year. Tony Todd has the cravat, the colours of the red and gold that link to the temptation of the sweet honey in the billies that killed him, and the blood, which is the red gore. This film is about a past that is anything but romantic. It's still a love story in many ways, but we can see how the more romantic Gothic films have relied on a past that's very, very white. Candyman achieved wealth and cravats and fur coats and the love of a white woman, and he was killed for it and made into a monster with a hooked hand. So Gothic about Black people in the 90s very much deconstructs a glossy period drama. So from 1985's adaptation of The Colour Purple, which was a melodrama with Gothic elements, to Beloved in 1998. Remember what we said about period drama reinforcing or undermining expectations. Look at the rich colours and the happy faces of people, undermining these ideas that it's just going to be a relentless, miserable slog about enslavement, right? So there is hope, there is love. So as Meisha Wester states about Black creators working in the genre, they seize it, write back to it and revise it, relocating the sense of horror in the very issues of ownership and dispossession at play. So there are multiple types of Gothic, right? And in this quick overview, we can only really address so many. So here, I've done a quick overview of 3 clear historic periods in the Gothic aesthetics that influenced our expectations of the genre in the 90s, and how these are sometimes undercut and challenged also. But some things remain in common, like a fear of disability. So the contemporary Gothic in cinema these aesthetics still haunted the films set in the present. So Guillermo del Toro, a master of the Gothic, in his film from 1993, Kronos, which is a vampire movie with a difference, really. We have the image of the old man up there. Sorry, it's poor quality. In a space surrounded by religious antiques, with an elegant wrought iron staircase. His personal style is the waistcoat and bow tie. There's tones of red and gold everywhere. He's holding a gold artifact. I'm sorry, the contrast is terrible. He's already heading towards the Gothic even before the blood curse kind of kicks in, right? In image 2, the way the sun shafts appear is like little halos of candles, and they even cause smoke when they hit the vampire shrouded in the blue twilight light. But we also see newer aspects in this film, an industrial Gothic coming in, developing those smooth concrete edges of modernism, but adding a hint of ruin with the abandoned factories and warehouses. There's corrugated iron, hanging chains, and flickering strip lighting. But a hint to the past too. Those tailor's dummies shrouded in plastic take on the look of veiled women perhaps, but with the muscular torsos queering it up just a little bit, because it's the early 90s and blood disease. So it's a great summary movie for these aesthetics, showing how they can almost travel through time with the myth of the vampire and perhaps the vampire themselves. And in 1994, industrial Gothic aesthetics and music brings us to the contemporary comic book adaptation, The Crow. In this promo image, we have a set that recalls us to the traditional Gothics, a Christian altar cloth, wrought iron, throne-like wooden chair of great antiquity, fallen iron girders in the background, and walls painted to look like paneling, which was a popular technique in the 18th century. So this draws on scenes in the film, a fight scene in a cathedral, the urban decay of Detroit, but also nods to our expectations of the Gothic that will not actually be reinforced in the film. And as for the costume, it starts out with the contemporary Gothic subculture, the leather trousers, his army boots, the clingy tight top of black sort of mesh, but we've got the bullet holes and the duct tape literally holding it together. That occurs after the fight scenes, but becomes a part of the Gothic styling in the subculture, right? It all goes round again. So the main character is introduced in the film as part of this music-based subculture. The police even use his band's promo picture for a visual ID after his murder. So here is the scene where Eric Draven, murdered musician, transforms into an undead superhero to avenge his dead fiancée. So we see him choosing to perform the Gothic, returning to his stage persona in a way. And we later see Draven perform a guitar solo on his roof to express his anger, hurt, and rage before he heads out to take on the final bad guy. So we're going to watch that now. We see the merging of the music video with the cinema there, right? We see these merging of Gothic aesthetics. So it's industrial, it's dark, it's lit in red. The chains hang from the ceiling, the scaffolding behind the stage, and these little gold sparks coming not from candles, but from sparks from an angle grinder or welder, and more industrial imagery. So we get this idea that there's different influences at play here. The music video and the music performance is central to this film. And it's a very modern industrial Gothic, which we're going to discuss in section 3. But who is this bad guy he's coming after? It is, do we recognize him? If I say why cousin, it is Guy of Gisborne from Robin Hood. So this guy is OG Gothic, right? That's his throne from the promo image. He likes candles and wrought iron and waistcoats and high boots. And he's even having an incestuous affair with his witch half-sister. So the film layers up ideas of the Gothic in the present and blending different aspects of our expectations of what Gothic looks like aesthetically, but also what cinema Gothic can be, taking influences from the music video and blending them in, but also from previous Gothic adaptations. So look at who is playing his key henchman there in the 1930s gangster suit. That's Tony Todd, that's the Candyman himself. So I think that that is an ideal film to end this section on. Okay, part 2, Gothic in mainstream music, right? So some form of Gothic aesthetic is absolutely everywhere in the 90s. from Disney to boy bands to folk rock to comic books. And I'm going to suggest that the Gothic became popular in the 90s in this period of culture wars, similar in feel to the current era in many ways, because these binaristic ideas that it can represent, nostalgia and rebellion, transgression and conformity, and these become weaponized ideologies in the political arena of the era. So the Gothic aesthetics in wider popular culture range from the traditional Gothic of the haunted mansion, and we've seen that in music videos from the Chili Peppers to Celine Dion, and the dance parodies of the monster movies from Dracula and the Werewolf, from Michael Jackson to the Backstreet Boys. But what does the Gothic mode offer to a non-Gothic musician? The visual trappings of the traditional Gothic are echoed in many contemporary pop videos of this time, and I don't have time to show you all of them. So, oh, reminder, competition still running. So here's Madonna doing Catholic Gothic for Like a Virgin in the gold and the red tones with Black Jesus coming in. And then Guns N' Roses November Rain with the Twilight Blue, and they stage a whole wedding and then a funeral. So, but what we're going to start with right now is a little bit of a return to the musical theatre, but not completely. Meatloaf's chart-topping Grammy Award-winning single, I Would Do Anything for Love from 1993. Here we go. It's a 7-minute epic. We have to stop it somewhere, right? But it's a bit like letting the bass drop with that one, right? You got to wait for it all to kick in and the motorcycle to come through the wall. So we have got so much going on there. Did you note the tone shift from the yellows to the twilight blues? Did we see the candelabra drop? Well, that's Phantom, isn't it? We've got proper all-out musical theatre. So the important stuff, though, what I think is important. So we've got Gothic tropes, including a heroine in a A-line white frock, or the vampire line, as Catherine Spooner would call it, a castle full of candelabra, the gilt furniture, the wood furniture, dramatic staircases. But the facial prosthetics are interesting. So they're reminiscent of Beauty and the Beast, but what Meatloaf's video and G.R.R. Martin's TV adaptation of Beauty and the Beast only dare to hint at, but Guillermo del Toro is now willing to openly admit, is that there is a known audience of self-identifying monster fuckers out there. The cinema critic John Hartle reviewed Disney's Beauty and the Beast, acknowledging the thrilling possibility of the sexy beast. You may feel the way Greta Garbo did when she emerged from Jean Cocteau's live-action 1946 version. Give me back my beast, she is reported to have said. So we have potentially sexy beasts, right? But this beast has makeup that blends an exaggerated brow ridge that suggests later on the vampires that will come in Buffy. So it's clearly been an influence on later Gothics, but with the long fingernails and long hair and a sort of cloak. And there's a mix here of masculine and feminine signifiers. So he's a gender bending monster. And in musicals drawing on the romantic Gothic, despite there being a heteronormative love story at the heart of these, they perform a heteronormativity that is in fact missing most of the time, especially from the lyrics, right? Where the unspeakable leaves the space for the queer. Meatloaf would do anything for love, but he won't do that. Ahem, right? So we know how this video goes, hopefully, but I'm just going to click through to some images. Sorry, can't get rid of it. But you can see this, the Gothic space of the chateau with these candles and these candelabras. This is a romantic Gothic, but it's also a gore Gothic. There's sort of blood rituals and stuff going on. So a tamer version, right? Because Meatloaf is full on rock and roll, bless him. We've got the tamer version in Celine Dion's classic, It's All Coming Back to Me Now from 1996. And it's a particularly notable example of the romantic Gothic. I'm going to play clips from it, but not the actual video to try and save some time. So I'm sorry you won't hear the lovely song, just visually see it. So we've got the woman haunted by the ghost or memory of her dead lover who's been killed in a motorcycle accident. There are direct visual callbacks to 1991's Beauty and the Beast as well, we will see, and the past and the Gothic dresses, castles, etc. Here's another one. Look at the billowing draperies, the scroll work, their candles. And there's a lone candlestick and this 18th century style golden gown, which I think is very Beauty and the Beast. And the lightning storm and haunted mansion. But the lyrics, which you can't hear, they sing of things she'd never do again, but then they always felt right. And she ends the song with a haunting whisper, and if we, but she refuses to name the act. What the act may be, the idea that it is potentially queer, right, is suggested by a particular scene when Dion's shadow transforms into her lover's. But since he's not on screen and is in fact potentially dead, this is now her shadow. So is this an aspect of her, a butch alter ego? How do we read these merging identities of her and the motorcycle rider, right? The film wants us to heteronormative romance, right? But straightness is in the eye of the beholder here. And in the liminal space of the Gothic, the conservative heteronormativity of romantic narratives is always tinged with the thrill of the forbidden. As Dion's ghostly lover leaves at the end of the video, she focuses nostalgically on past transgression rather than being pleased that the supernatural aberration has passed. And what is remembered is ambiguous. Is it Gothic transgression or romantic normativity? The past is thus both idealized and romanticized, but it's also never fully realized. The ability of the Gothic to suggest the thrill of recognition, a thrill of transgression, but also a comforting idea of timelessness, and even a discomforting idea of haunting, all at the same time, unsettles any straightforward, pun intended, interpretations. So we must remember that this is the period of Tipper Gore's PMRC campaigns, of the video nasties rhetoric, and frequent claims that heavy metal music was not so secretly a Satanist recruitment tool for impressionable young minds. The rise and influence of the neoconservatives got CDs and tapes labelled with parental advisory stickers and music videos banned from MTV. The hint of the Gothic was just transgressive enough to escape the censor, but suggestive of so much more. And this is the dynamic that I suggest prompts the Gothic light aesthetic choices for safe teeny bopper bands like Boyzone and the Backstreet Boys. So this is 1995's video for Love Me for a Reason. So what are they doing in a vaulted cellar like the Phantom of the Opera, right? These nice, clean pressed boys. Well, I want to draw attention to the waistcoats, right? This is not 2007. Will Schuster has not yet ruined musical theatre for a generation. This waistcoat, or vest for the Americans among us, is a very particular look in the mid-90s, also to be found in videos by Wet 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 and the Crash Test Dummies, which we'll be seeing in a minute. But this video here, this styling, is a little bit different from the Backstreet Boys' 1998's Backstreet Backs, which is a dance video drawing strongly on Michael Jackson's Thriller, and the dance moves. But we see here a deliberate appeal to a sort of Halloween-y Gothic, right? Candlelight, dramatic staircase. Key band members are wearing this older, more romantic style of the waistcoat and white shirt, more vampiric look. So instead, for Boyzone and for Celine Dion, oh yes, we have a co-option of this Gothic that has been defanged. And I'd suggest that the link, and there is a clear link between the cinematic Gothic and the music videos here through these particular fashion choices, is Brad Pitt. See, I told you he'd be back. So as the vampire Louis de Pontelac, Pitt embodies a much talked about new man of the era, right? Emotionally engaged, somewhat fluid sexuality, and good grooming. The metrosexual that Ross Geller always wanted to be. But Louis is also a product of a very particular period of the past, a haunting presence from a period when an audience who hasn't read George Haggerty might assume that men were men and women signed and pined for them. Aware of his history of privilege and charmingly conflicted, but not enough to really do anything about it except moan to a journalist, Louis is a compromised man with a moral compass and sympathetic to women. It's important because Louis' aesthetic meshed with Pitt's own image as a sex symbol and became very popular. He was never out of a waistcoat, right? As you can see here. Pitt played variations of this particular ideal of American masculinity in the aforementioned Legends of the Fall, A River Runs Through It, and also Seven with its 1930s noir aesthetics it draws on. So all films set in the early 20th century or aping its aesthetics. And I think it's important to fit this into the framework of the Gothic. So through the figure of Brad Pitt, I think we can trace the unifying iconography of American nostalgia and this romantic ideal, the capital R again, that unites all of this imagery. We can find in him and in his popularity a link that pairs a waistcoat with a candelabra, a classic motorcycle with a gilt mirror frame. But the problem is that to return to the aesthetics of the past, it is always reconfigured through the modern lens, and in this case, the Gothic lens, which means it's changed and reimagined. What is Gothic is, as we have seen, often aligned with what is queer. And this can be seen in the fashion choices too. When people thought that they were dressing like Brad Pitt, what they actually looked like most of the time was lesbians. Remember that period 10 years ago when everyone said that there were lesbians who looked like Justin Bieber and that was a popular Tumblr? Well, back in the 90s, we had lesbians who looked like Leonardo DiCaprio. Or was it Leonardo DiCaprio who looked like a lesbian, right? It was an iconic look. The big shirt collars, the waistcoats, the suspenders, or we don't call them that in the UK, you know what I mean? So this was a recalling in some ways of one half of the 1930s butch femme dichotomy. And to reinforce this in the Gothic, let's see K.D. Lang, the Mac Daddy lesbian of the 90s music scene, rocking it. But as we can see there, K.D. Lang with the big open shirt and the white on black look, the black and white aesthetic. And we have the performance, this theatre performance is happening in a Gothic theatre with ironwork and ceiling plaster rows. But the audience seem to be from the 30s with their opulent gender-bending fashions going on there. The stage play, however, and the car that K.D. Lang is sitting in are probably from the 50s, right? The play looks like Waiting for Godot as more than anything. So we have this confusion of eras, though. It's an unspecified mid-20th century, a past very much associated with defined binaristic gender roles, which are being messed with and queered here, right? But as I said, there isn't a simple divide between the queer and the not queer. A very similar video structure was used by the Crash Test Dummies, twice, in fact. So this is a still from a video for in 1993. A Burton-esque school play is taking place with kids acting out the lyrics to the song. But we're going to watch a bit of Superman's song from 1991. We are at Superman's funeral, right? With comic book characters coming in, dipping their hand in the font, going to sit down, and the band, backed by a string quartet, delivering some sort of eulogy, right? Which starts out talking about Tarzan instead of Superman. But what we've got is the sepia tones, the 1930s settings, the clothing, the red and the gold, and a church full of candles, a mix of the romantic Gothic and the 30s noir then, which comes from the comic book era of Superman's original development. So it's wholly and straightforwardly here Gothic for funeral purposes, right? We sometimes forget that the Gothic as a genre can be quite simply signifying and talking about death, mourning, grieving, and all those sorts of things. So we have these binaries don't really stand up anytime, right? Everything is complicated. You can't just go, it's all queer or it's all not queer. But we're going to head into, for the last video of this section, heading towards the alternative and into some of the freakier body Gothic, as we mentioned earlier, with the Chili Peppers and Soul to Squeeze, also from 1993. Oh, no, that's the wrong one. That one is. So you might be thinking, is this just not the carnivalesque rather than the Gothic? But no, that trailer that Flea was sitting in to play bass has a nameplate identifying its owner as Hans Otto, who is the central character of Todd Browning's Gothic film Freaks from 1932. This is the film from which the Ramones took the chant "Gabba Gabba Hey," as the circus performers chant it before saying, one of us, we accept you, one of us. This is a film about being an outsider. It's from the perspectives of the freaks, the monsters, and they get their revenge in the end. It reverses the usual monster movie tropes. It was a big shocker on its release and almost ended Todd Browning's career. He went on to make films, but they didn't do as well as Dracula had. The song's lyrics of melancholy, drug addiction, and madness are definitely suited to a Gothic treatment. The Medusa imagery there, Anthony Kiedis with the snakes on his head, echoes also the headshots of Freddie Mercury with the bananas on his head in Queen's video for I'm Going Slightly Mad. And this is a video about performers displaying their own experiences, drawing on the experience of being a Gothic subject. And thus it fits into the traditions of K.D. Lang, say, better than it does of Meatloaf, performing just enough Gothic to transgress and to signify otherness, but remaining safe enough for MTV. After all, the controversy of Freaks and Waiting for Godot is over, it's done. This is past transgression we're calling on in some ways. And as Celine Dion shows us, that's safe enough for a very mainstream TV audience. It's a Gothic that not even the PMRC can claim is linked to Satanism. But it doesn't mean that we can't layer up all these associations and images. We can get away with all kinds of weird sexual associations with snakes, performers, body non-normativity. And we can start thinking about how they signify to us now, and also what they meant in the past, and why we keep drawing on a Gothic past in a very modern era. So thank you for paying attention to section 2. So in the early 90s, musically, in British and American pop culture at least, goth as a musical form and subculture was still predominantly associated with the 80s. And bands like The Cure, Susie and the Banshees, and Bauhaus. However, like its literary predecessors in the 18th century, after a first wave explosion that established certain audience expectations and some parameters, the format grew and developed in a variety of directions, rising and falling in popularity, but never really dying. And then it became sort of unrecognizable to itself. So in the 90s, bands like the Sisters of Mercy were unmistakably still goth AF. Typo Negative were both metal and goth. And Nine Inch Nails came along to get kinky with everyone. So endless arguments about whether Trent Reznor's protégés, Marilyn Manson, are goth or not have now been raging for about 20 years at this point. And musicians who really did want to scare, thrill, and disturb had quite a lot of work to do to reinterpret the genre for themselves, to stay ahead of the mainstream that was full of sexy vampires, cop vampires, and beast people on the subway. So heavy metal and hip hop are often characterized as monstrous by outsiders to these subcultures, seeming to embody aggression and anger, with lyrics focusing on violence and misogynistic objectification of women often. However, both these genres also vocalize experiences of mental health problems, feelings of isolation and oppression with sympathy and depth. And the new metal scene we'll revisit in a bit, drew a lot from hip hop. So we're going to start by taking a look at the Gothic side of hip hop. Horacore developed during the 80s, growing out of the psychological horror of gangster rap, with tracks like Mind Playing Tricks on Me by the Ghetto Boys. And with bands like Gravediggers and Flatliners, they reference horror cinema and its metaphors, such as mad science, undead resurrection, waking nightmares. Horacore was described by Entertainment Weekly in 1995 as a blend of hardcore rap and bloodthirsty metal. But this is completely wrong. There is no metal here. It's just hip hop. And so already it's being misinterpreted by the mainstream, who are clearly not actually listening to it, but basing themselves on stereotypes. But what it does do is uses imagery of death, blood, and violence as metaphorical political rhetoric, descriptive of lives structured by poverty and drug use and run-ins with the carceral justice system. So we're going to watch the video for Gravediggers' 1994 Diary of a Madman, which uses the imagery of incarceration, madness, and infestation. So content warning for those. Okay, we don't have a lot of time to go into a lot of it, but you get a sense, and hopefully people will go on and watch this. So we get the band rapping in this Gothic cathedral, interspersed with images of a ritual where clergy victimize a black man, courtroom drama, crime, trips through the subterranean city, and images of infestation and infection as well. We get some medical Gothic coming in there. So merging the courtroom drama with an unreliable narrator describing their own insanity, the track functions a bit like a sort of rap Twilight Zone episode in some ways. We are aligned with a murderous monster or with the falsely accused, a bit like Justine from Frankenstein, and not Victor. Definitely, at no point, Victor. The band used the same original Gothic reference points, though, setting up a division between Muslim and Christian, patient experience and medical institutions, and the experience of justice and actual justice. The central concerns of the gravediggers are that systematic violence is perpetrated by white systems of power, like the church and the law courts, towards black people. Gravediggers want their audience to recognize that race is about heritage, culture, and lived experience as well, acknowledging the influence of the past on the present. There is, the band suggests in another song, nowhere to run to, nowhere to hide from this history. And that song of the same title has a video where a modern black man becomes his own ancestor, an enslaved ancestor, and then comes back to the modern period, sort of through these intercut narratives. So these are young black men working in the traditions of the Gothic critique to explore a liminal position within society. And we can hear in their work echoes of Ralph Ellison's statement that the Black American experiences a sensation that he does not exist in the real world at all. He seems, rather, to exist in the nightmarish fantasy of the white American mind as a phantom to be laid to rest. Which is not to say there's no hope, no positive possibilities again. In brief spoken word interludes between tracks on their first album, RZA says the band are digging graves of the mentally dead, resurrecting the mentally dead from their states of unawareness and ignorance. And Poetic responds, you must become a gravedigger to listen to a gravedigger. Yet a 1994 New York Times reviewer took Horacore to task as a convenient excuse for spouting tasteless lyrics that are neither clever nor original, claiming the genre as a new problem for critics. Yet, by contrast, the same paper had glowingly reviewed Metallica in 1991, mostly by ignoring much of their lyrical content. So the idea that gravediggers are more violent and aggressive than the band who made Kill 'Em All is ludicrous. And that the idea that they have less to say about politics and justice for all is just wrong. Gravediggers remained, however, within a marginal subculture, but the individual members achieved much greater success within the Wu-Tang Clan and as producers for Stetasonic and De La Soul, bands I'm sure that many of you will recognize the name of. So tellingly, the most financially successful horrorcore bands are white guys, such as the Insane Clown Posse. What does this tell us about the marketable Gothic, right? We're not going to go too much into really subcultural Gothic here. I want to talk about Gothic that made it onto MTV and influenced what we think of as being the definitive Gothic of a decade. Assassinate them! This is what we might call definitively Gothic, the Sisters of Mercy, right? So here we go to the expected space of the Gothic and its most recognized incarnations. From 1992, Temple of Love. So we've got a goth collage here, right? And that's an image that we're going to come back to, the idea of this collage, this layering of ideas. After a slow start, there's actually quite a lot of rapid fire imagery. And this is before the days that you can pause and rewind live TV. So this is a bombardment of symbolism, but we'll do what we can, right? So there are echoes of the sublime landscape, urban decay, temples, graveyards, moon, and fog. The singer is styled in two different ways in just that brief clip that we saw. Once rather resembling David Bowie in The Hunger, an 80s vampire movie in which Bauhaus performed live. There are layers later on of roses, doves, and exotic women. So it doesn't have a clear narrative, a clear focus. We might suggest that love and peace, given the doves and the roses, but there are many, many possible interpretations. This is a goth souffle, if you like. Poke it and it collapses. This is really a video for the days when MTV was like the radio. You just had wall-to-wall videos rather than the reality TV that came to dominate later in the decade. And perhaps you didn't need your audience to stop and focus so long as they heard you. If you turn around at any point whilst making dinner to watch that video, you'll see something Gothic, something immediately and recognizably connected to the Gothic. So by the mid-90s, however, arresting videos were winning awards and controversy. So next up, we're going to go with another band who released their first music in the 80s, but rose to fame through the 90s, Nine Inch Nails. So I think we can tell from this image that we've got industrial Gothic with those, I can't think of the word for that stuff. Barbed wire, that's the word. So Reznor is originally from Cleveland, Ohio, solidly in the Rust Belt, and therefore I can't resist this 90s reference. O mio, o mio, o Cleveland, Ohio. Also, there aren't enough girls in this section, so that's just an excuse to get another girl in there. So here is 1994's Closer. So trigger warning for both body gore and animal distress as well. We don't have a narrative on this one exactly, right? But I would suggest that we do have a curated experience more than in the last collage. Perhaps an art exhibition with a clear theme is the best idea of thinking about this. The human heart removed from its shell compared to the slabs of meat, perhaps making a link that the more romantic vampire films fail to, with us becoming food. The monkey on the cross links ideas of Darwinian evolution to Christian religion that still in places denies this science. The setting is some kind of decaying medical establishment, it seems, and we're again repositioned from aligning with the role of Victor the experimenter to the monster subjects of the experiment. We're scared and confused, and so it seems is Trent when he looks at us like, what is the purpose of all this? It's like a cabinet of curiosities from the past in many ways, but one in disrepair, and also one that has living exhibits, a commentary on the very idea of these collections and these views of difference and display of difference. The style of the video also draws our attention to its construction, with the flicker of the film stock and the title card and the stylings of it. A hint back to a cinematic past, a framing of the Gothic elements that have been deliberately chosen and curated for us. And things are framed throughout the video as well. Those big Gothic draperies in red, framing the crucifix. So this is a coded performative space, a historical space, a critical space, and an upsetting space. There is so much again to unpack here, but it feels much more like this is a unified message that is coming through in this video, I would suggest. And we'll see a lot of echoes of these elements in the next video, which is from the slightly more mainstream Marilyn Manson, who is in some ways coded societally as Trent Reznor's protege at this time. So that is Marilyn Manson in the early days when they were still calling themselves Marilyn Manson and the Spooky Kids. So we can see that they're a lot less Gothic. In fact, they look like the Clarissa Explains It All drag review. That's a Melissa Joan Hart sitcom, by the way. But very soon, the band had become less ambiguous about their Gothic leanings, but they were still playing with gender in the ways that they're doing there. So the musicians named themselves after serial killers and dead Hollywood starlets. Twiggy Ramirez, Marilyn Manson, Daisy Berkowitz. A mid-century flavour, the 50s and the 60s coming through here, a subversion still of ideas of Hollywood glamour. And their imagery deconstructs gender and sexuality, American identities, and seeks to shock and even disgust by placing themselves in the position of the abject, for those with a psychoanalytical bent. They invite the gaze, unlike Reznor, who disappears from his own video, looks away from the camera, or wears goggles to cover his eyes. And the song we're going to play is The Beautiful People from 1996. Again, we have a medicalized subject here, with ideas of surgical supports and trusses, perhaps suggesting prosthesis as well. These are the things that usually support a body that needs something extra added to it. But Manson has all his limbs, so is he missing another? So suggestions of physical monstrosity there. And the imagery of the institution is invoked, with repeating rows of body parts, storage for strange and horrible things, Are we again on the side of the victim though? The rapid fire imagery, the camera distortion, it makes it harder for us to make the connections and interpretations, I think, here. It renders us maybe a little passive, even as it creates unease. The faceless imagery, the doll-like positioning of the disabled bodies without their heads as well often, or with their faces disguised, dehumanizes. And is this a comment on wider political import about medicalization and the body and disability? Or is it just a side effect of some stylistic choices here? Whereas Nine Inch Nails lyrics are very obviously political, with God money dancing on the backs of the poor. The Manson lyrics are a little less pointed. And I think it was Jonathan Ross who once declared Manson the emeritus professor of the bleeding obvious. And I have to agree. That disabled people are excluded and that ugly people don't succeed as much as beautiful people, this is already well known. What is he adding to our understanding that freaks didn't get there already to discuss with an own voices perspective that was actually much more developed even in the 30s than this from the 90s, where the actually disabled bodies don't have a voice. They're just there for the show. They are literally lined up like an audience for Manson to perform to. So there's a lot more we can say about all of this. There's so many layers and there's so much in these videos. There's ideas of surgery, of interventions into the body, of remaking bodies. But I don't have that much time. But I think that possibly the idea of making simpler points is one of the things that makes Marilyn Manson popular with the high school crowd in this period. He's quite easily understood in some ways. It's very clearly an outsider perspective. It's very quick. It's very consumable, to use a terrible term, I guess. So this is the era of the mall goth, the baby bat, the doom cookie, the hot topic goth, as referenced in the title to this talk. And these terms are pretty familiar to many of us. So let's start by defining some of our terms, as we say in the lecture hall. These started out as derogatory labels imposed by older subculture participants who often saw the teenagers adopting these style choices as imposters or weekend warriors. This attitude is, of course, gatekeeping, of a sort familiar to many fandoms. However, the names reflect not only an air of superiority with the infantilizing language, but also suggest wider values of the OG subculture. Mall goth and hot topic goth in particular are anti-commercialization slogans. And I heard from a lot of older goths in the 90s about how they had to make their world from scratch, the clothes to the music, and how they felt it was very different for kids who could just buy Gothic fashion off the shelf in a mainstream commercial outlet. But there's a charming Instagram dedicated to cataloguing these looks called 1990s Mall Goth. And its founder, Trinity Levy, refutes these claims of early easy commercialization, saying, the authenticity and individuality of mall goth culture is definitely what I find most interesting and lovable. You definitely have to have a certain level of confidence to rock it, and I love that. And she has a point. There might have been a hot topic in most malls in America, but there might have only been one or two hot topic goths in any given high school. You probably did have to commit to social ostracism, some bullying, and loneliness as you tried to signal to your tribe that you were of them, but also an individual within them. So these images have a central contradiction at their heart as one of a limited range of options easily accessible to youth in the late 90s to signal rebellion, individuality, and difference. So what music do they listen to, and where is it lacking in its gothness? Well, we're going to watch a little video from Coal Chamber now. Coal Chamber come from a very metal background in their native Los Angeles, championed by Fear Factory in the early 90s before they even recorded, and then touring with the likes of Machine Head and the grindcore Napalm Death later in the 90s. A solid little metal lineage, we might call that. So here's Coal Chamber's 1996 Loco off their first album, and it's kind of the sound of my youth, because I was in my early teens and exactly the right age for this. What's going on here? Well, we seem to have a silent movie era villain, but wearing a 1950s good humor man or delivery driver uniform, perhaps, and brothel creepers. So we're in the safety of suburbia with a neo-colonial space set up in opposition to the Gothic, and perhaps wealthy households under threat. but the people inside are already the weirdos. You know, we are the weirdos, mister, to quote The Craft. So what is the significance of this corrupted viewfinder that we're looking through? Are they being shown themselves as they are? Are they more loco towards the end than at the beginning? The film deliberately separates this space of the performance from the space of the narrative. And we see the band members, well, it would seem, at home in the domestic space. And though one is perhaps innocently playing jumping jacks on the porch, the others are being very goth. So we just saw Des sewing some sort of voodoo doll, possibly with red wool. And we see their bass player watching a tiny rocking chair move on its own in the next scene, as if there's a sort of child ghost haunting him. So this video suggests that the Gothic is at home in suburbia, like the Addams Family maybe. So the themes of alienation, insanity, and disruption of the normative that come out of the song are very definitely Gothic for sure. But the aesthetic of the band members mixes signifiers from California punk, skater subcultures, and the goth. So why do we care so much about these relatively empty signifiers, perhaps, when the content of the Gothic critique in the song and the video remains consistent with what has gone before? And they're drawing on a solid metal lineage in the music, but a solid Gothic lineage in their aesthetics. When, unlike Boyzone, who also adopt the romantic Gothic, they are willing to embrace the transgressive potentials of the Gothic and to its challenge to dominant culture, and its sometimes harmful stigmatizations of the different, the Gothic and the different, the odd and the neuroatypical, right? So we see the mainstream use of the Gothic and the actual Gothic aligned artists are working in different traditions. The former is very much about a continuation of the romantic sublime, whereas the latter seeks to provoke the terror and the disturbance side of the Gothic more. And as Isabella van Elferen notes, Gothic popular culture transgresses current cultural norms and reframes and reinterprets those of previous eras as an act that intervenes with the nature of the thing remembered. And the thing being remembered or re-articulated here is the Gothic itself, which is why I wanted this talk to cover not only the chosen Gothic aesthetics in their distilled form, for people literally saying, hello, yes, we want this, we are part of this, but how it comes to bleed into the wider cultural industries. But this last section, I think, has raised a key question. Where is our Gothic heroine? How do all these straight white men get to claim the Gothic, right? As we've seen a lot of those on screen. Well, here's a quick example of our favorite Gothic inflected band, Churasatana. Very quick clip. I think we can see ideas of medicalization and the alignment of the medicalization perhaps with the church, these institutions of power. But the thing to note there is that that shoddy quality is not because my internet connection just went. It's because that's the best quality version of this you can find on any of the major platforms, okay? And this was the problem I found. Female musicians and female-led bands aren't on the big platforms of YouTube and Vimeo and places like that in quality versions. Female musicians seem to have been working on lower budgets as well. I wonder why. They've kind of been written out of the narrative again. So how is it that those who profit most from the Gothic are still abusive white men? We've all heard about the allegations of Marilyn Manson by now. And if we were in the subculture before, but if you weren't, through Evan Rachel Wood's testimony has made them known to the world. And I just want to finish on that note that the 90s Gothic was reinterpreted mostly through a lens that was not like Anne Radcliffe's of the first Mary Shelley's, the Bronte sisters. We have increasingly got in the 20th century a very male viewpoint of the Gothic here. And I find that very interesting. Thank you very much for your attention. Oh, I can't make this work. There we go. That's my thank you.
Thank you very much. I just